Welcome back. So we have a little bit of cleanup that we have to do before we can jump into this lesson. After the previous episode, we wrote the book reservations test, but we didn't really create any commits for it. So let's go ahead and wrap that up before we start this lesson. So all we need to do is really just put all of this into a single commit. It is all related to each other, so we can simply just say book checkout sequence. So we'll go ahead and do that, and we can get started with this lesson. So as we spoke before in the previous lesson, we have the unit test in place for the book reservation. But what would happen now is if we had an actual view where we could do this, there would be no way for us to actually perform these actions. And that's where a feature test comes in. We spoke a little bit about this in the previous lesson, and we actually took a look at the book management test where we see that we actually hit a particular endpoint, and then we're just asserting that the correct action was taken by our application by seeing how the database changed before and after we hit that endpoint. So we need to do the same thing for the book checkout and check-in sequence. So let's do that now. Let's start with a test. PHP Artisan make test. And for the name, how about book checkout test? Of course, we did not pass the -- unit, which made that a feature test. And if we go back here, we do see it inside the features directory. All right, so let's go ahead and open this up, but I will keep this test behind here because I basically need an endpoint for each of the actions that this test can perform. All right, so let's go ahead and clean this up and start a fresh test. And this very first test, let's see what it's going to be. So the first test in the unit is a book can be checked out. Now, for a book to be able to be checked out, then of course we need a book and we need a user. So we can take a different approach with our feature test. We can basically assume that we are going to be using the authenticated user to perform this action, as opposed to having the user be passed in. So with that, all we really need is just a book. So let's write a test that says a book can be checked out. And maybe let's be specific and say by a signed in user. So obviously, if you are the signed in user, you are able to check out your own books. Now, we did speak about a separate version of this where perhaps a librarian would be able to check out a book for you. Instead of you being logged in, the librarian would be logged in. We are not ready to tackle that, so we're going to go ahead and ignore that for now, but we are set up to do that. So that's going to be a nice little additional thing that we've already pre-planned. So what kind of endpoint are we going to hit? Well, I know for a fact that, first of all, I need to be acting as a user. So let's go ahead and create a factory and then use the user class to create a new user. And then we're going to go ahead and hit a post route, and perhaps we could just call it /checkout/ maybe the book ID. So that reminds me, we do need a book, otherwise we wouldn't be able to check out a book. So let's create a book as well. So factory book class, and we do need to create that in our database. So we'll go ahead and hit the create method on it, and do notice up here we are importing book and user. So we're going to hit /checkout/ book ID. And we can grab that simply from this variable that we created there. So if this action performed correctly, then of course what can we assert? Well, basically we can assert the same exact thing that we are asserting here. So let's go ahead and move that over. And we do need to import the reservation. So let's go ahead and do that. So now we have app reservation up here. And so the user ID, well, we can't really just say user because the user ID would be the one that's in here. But one thing we can do if we wanted to is we can actually inline save user. This is a PHP feature that you can use where you can actually assign a variable right inline. This, of course, would be the same thing then if we grab this and put it out here and then we passed in user. Same exact thing. It does save you a line, so I will use that approach from time to time. So we are going to go ahead and hit that endpoint acting as this user, and then we're going to use that user to make sure that we in fact did create the correct reservation. All right, let's go ahead and run this test. PHP unit -- filter. I do have a little shortcut for that. So we don't have a table for authors. So we know that's because we are not refreshing our database. So let's go ahead and use refresh database trait. And let's see now. So now, of course, we get to the part where, well, it doesn't quite work. but we don't get the correct error. Now, if you remember, all these feature tests, typically to get them started, you have to run without exception handling. The exception handling is just the way that Laravel bubbles up exceptions into proper HTTP responses with the correct error. So that feature actually we need to turn off for us to actually get the underlying error. So in our test, and now of course we get a very different error. The one we get now is the not found HTTP exception. We know that, of course, there is no route at checkout. So let's go ahead and add that route now. Let's go to our web.php file. Let's create a whole new section here for route post, and it's going to be /checkout/ and then we're going to have a variable. So if you remember, of course, we use the curly brackets book, and then let's hit a new controller, the checkout book controller at, and what are we going to hit? What would make sense if we are creating a checkout? So let's go ahead and call that store. Now, of course, we could rename this instead of checkout and just call it reservation. Reservation is kind of a big term. We're going to end up adding a feature that allows us to actually reserve a book and then go ahead to the library and check it out. So that's why I've called that reservation. But for this particular instance, checkout would be perfectly fine. That way we have a nice controller that all it's able to do is just handle the checkout flow for that. So that's very nice. Let's go ahead and run our test. And of course, our controller is going to fail now. It says checkout controller does not exist. All right, let's go ahead and create one. PHP Artisan make controller checkout book controller, and run that test again. So now we get that the store method does not exist. All right, so let's go back here to the checkout books controller, and let's create a new store method. Store. There we go. Run that test again. And now we do get to the final part here where we are asserting that we don't in fact have that. Now, the nice thing with us writing that unit test is that, well, we kind of know what needs to happen. We know that essentially all we need to do is this code right here. So let me copy that code and let's bring it over to our store method. So how do we get book? Well, of course, we could use route model binding. We have this book here, and that's going to be a variable of a book. So we can accept a book. So remember, in Laravel, all we need to do is type in book as a model. Notice how it's being imported up here. And now we do have access to that. So the user, how do we get our user? Like I said, we're going to presume that we're talking about the authenticated user. So I'll go ahead and grab that now. And then let's go ahead and run that test. And sure enough, we are green. Awesome. Of course, we do need to test that only signed in users can actually check out a book. So let's do that now. Let's write a new test, and let's call this one only signed in users can check out a book. The setup is going to be almost identical. I'm going to go ahead and grab all of this. Let's bring that down here. And actually, just to clean up on the first test, we don't need exception handling anymore. We know that test is passing. So what do we need to do here? Well, instead of acting as something, let's go ahead and delete that line altogether and attempt to hit that post route. Now, I do expect this to go ahead and just redirect us into the login page because, of course, we are just assuming that they forgot to log in. And then what we could do is we can actually assert that the count is still 0. And of course, we're not going to have any reservation that we can grab, so we would not be able to test those 3 things. Now, this additional step here is just a little bit of extra reassurance that we are, in fact, making sure that nothing got created in our database by accident. Now, we know that's not really possible, but it's always good to test. Let's go ahead and run that now. And of course, we fail. We get a 500. And I bet you what this is the fact that we are trying to grab the authenticated user, but it doesn't exist. So let's run that test without exception handling. Very different error this time. And there it is. So we are trying to get property ID of a non-object. That is in book line 20. Let's check that out. Let's go to the book model. And in line 20, we see here that, of course, we're trying to create a reservation and we're trying to grab the user ID. But at this stage, user is actually null. So, of course, as we've done before, to fix this, we need a constructor. And in the constructor, let's go ahead and use the middleware for auth. Laravel just makes this such a breeze to do. And with that, we are getting an invalid argument exception, and I'll show you why that is in just a second. But before we get to that, let me turn on exception handling and run that test again. So now we're getting a 500. And this can be a little bit confusing, and you may not understand it right away. But here's one thing. Yes, we are using Laravel's authentication, but we have actually never ran the makeauth command in this project. So what is happening is if we run PHP Artisan route list, you see that in none of our routes here, we actually have the route for login or logout or anything like that. Again, this just has to do with the fact that we haven't ran the PHP Artisan makeauth. So it is time for us to run that. So let's go ahead and make auth right now. So PHP Artisan makeauth. And now check out the difference. This, of course, is my list of routes before I ran makeauth. Let me run that command again. That's route list. And now, very different result. We do see a lot of new routes in here, including login, including logout, of course, your password reset sequence, registration methods. A lot more stuff is in this right now. In contrast, of course, down here, it would only be the routes that we've defined ourselves. Let's go ahead and run that test one more time, and let's see if we can get green. And we do. Let's run that whole test, not just the two tests. Let's run the whole file, PHP unit -- filter, and we are still good to go. Great. Let's move on to the next section. How about this? What if I give you a book that doesn't exist? That's a whole nother section. Only real books can be checked out. We're going to borrow a lot of the same logic from up here, but I'm not actually going to create a book. So instead of using the book ID, we need to hard code something in here. I will just put 1, 2, 3. So of course, at that point, we would want to assert that we have a count of 0 and there is no reservation. But what else should we really expect here? I mean, if a user does that, then really we're expecting a 404. So let's go ahead and make sure that we assert a status of 404, meaning nothing was found for ID 123. All right, let's go ahead and run that test. And sure enough, we are still green. Great, we're making great progress. Let's go back to the unit test and let's see. A book can be returned. All right, so let's go ahead and tackle that now. So up here we have a book can be checked out by a signed in user. Let me grab that and we're going to modify it. Let's make a new test. A book can be checked in by a signed in user. And I'm going to copy a lot of the same stuff up here. But of course, we're going to want to do the setup slightly different. So we are still going to need to be signed in as a user. And then let's go ahead and do a check-in for that book ID. But that reservation is not going to exist at this point. So we have two choices. We can either go ahead and hit this checkout endpoint first, and then go ahead and try to do the check-in point, or we can actually go into our database and create a reservation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about both approaches. And what I mean by that is the following. We can really simply grab this and put it over here. And that would become part of the setup for this test. Of course, it would probably be better if we grabbed the user and just created a single user. And then instead of actually reassigning this, we would put user. So that's what it would look like. I think this approach is the better approach, because the other thing that you can do is instead of having something like that for your setup, you could actually go into your reservation and go ahead and create a record in there where basically your checked in time is maybe now sub days, let's just say 2, and then the user ID will of course be some sort of user ID that you grab from up here. So your user ID would be the user ID. A little bit of pseudocode here, but you get the point. So the reason why I like the approach of actually hitting the endpoint is twofold. First of all, we are doing a feature test, so of course we're basically testing the entire sequence through and through. But the most important reason I feel is that when you're hitting the endpoint, any changes that you make to that endpoint would break your test. If all of a sudden we had this new field, we'll call it random field, in our actual implementation, we would actually have to go back to each test and make sure that we added that back in because we are manually creating the reservation. For a feature test, this feels too low level. It's good in our unit test. We're basically doing the same thing. We're grabbing factories, we're grabbing the model directly, we're manipulating it, we're making sure that everything checks out. That's low level. That's unit testing. We are feature testing. This feels absolutely too low level of a test for a feature test. So I'm going to take the previous approach and actually hit the endpoint. That way we know we're testing the full sequence. So let's create a book, let's create a user, then acting as that user, I'm going to check out that book, and then I'm going to attempt to check it back in. So at that point, we still believe we should have a single reservation, and the user ID should still match with the book ID. However, the checked in time should also be now. We can actually check both if we wanted to. This is just a little bit of redundant testing because we do have this initial test up here that already tells us that the check out sequence is working properly. But it never hurts to add an additional assertion here. So let's go ahead and run this test now. And so we get, did not expect the type of object. That is in line 66. So line 66 is this line right here. And of course, it's basically just saying, well, there's something happening here because I don't have a checked in time. Let's go ahead and disable exception handling again, as we've done before. And let's run that test again. So now we get the correct error, not found exception. We know that there is no check-in route at all. So let's go ahead and grab that check-in route and go back to our web routes and add a new section here for check-in. Now notice here the auth routes, that is what actually got added by make auth. We didn't really check that out. We're not too concerned with that. Remember, we're concerned just with the back end for now. So this, of course, is going to hit a check-in controller. So a check-in book controller, which is not going to exist. But let's go ahead and run the test. Let the test guide us there. And there it is. So there is no check-in controller. So PHP, Artisan, make controller, check-in book controller. Let's run the test again. Now it should be something about the store method. And sure enough, there is no store method. Back to PHP Storm, check-in controller. Let's create a new method for store. Run the test again. And now we're back to the same error. But this time we know what is going on. All right, so let's go back to our unit test. And a book can be returned. All we need to do is grab our book and check in a user. All right, perfect. Let's go back here. Of course, let's go ahead and accept the book and accept that as a variable. Remember, we are importing up here at the top. And then all we need to do is check in that book. Now, in terms of the user, again, we're going to grab the authenticated user and make sure that that is properly working. All right, let's run that test again. We are good to go. So we are passing. All right, let's keep going through this. Let's go back here and let's create sort of the same basic tests that we have here. Let's go ahead and copy these other two tests because we need to create something very similar for the check-in sequence. So I'm going to paste these in and let's modify them. For now, I will just comment out this one and let's say only signed in users can check in a book. All right, so we're going to create a book. We're going to hit the checkout. That's just setup for now. But then we're going to hit the check-in with the book ID, and I do expect to be redirected as well. All right, let's run that test now. We get a 500, which is not a redirect status code. And if we want to see what the real error is, of course, without exception handling will fix that for us. And there we go. So the error that we're getting is unauthenticated. Now for this is a little tricky, right? So we are going to need to be authenticated for this part. That way we can get the sequence correct. So let's add that back in. Let's say this acting as, and then let's go ahead and whip up in a factory. Let's grab a user, and then we'll go ahead and persist that. Does that make sense? Remember, this is all part of the setup. We are really testing check in, not check out. But in order for us to create a proper checkout, we do need to be signed in. All right, let's go ahead and run that test. All right, and so we get a 200. which is not a redirection error. And that is in line 79. And line 79 is right here. Now, of course, because we are signing in, we should not be redirected. That's a mistake on my part. Let's get rid of that line. And now we've moved on to line 81. So, of course, in line 81, that's where we are supposed to be redirecting, but we are not. So let me go ahead and get rid of exception handling. And let me now add that in to my check-in controller. So in the check-in controller, as we've done before, let's add a constructor. We'll just say this middleware auth. Run that test again. Now when we run our test, we run into a bit of an issue here. So we're actually back to line 79. But if you remember, line 79 is this line over here. It doesn't quite make sense. Why are we not redirecting? Well, as it turns out, when you log in a user, Laravel actually continues to have that user be logged in. So we actually need to log out. But how do we log out? Well, that's fairly simple. We're going to use auth. We're going to use illuminate support facades auth. And then we can call the logout method on it. And now this did get imported at the top. Let me show you. So if we go back up here, there it is. Illuminate support facades auth. So now we're going to log in, but then we're going to log out to hit the check-in. That way the checkout sequence works perfectly and we're still able to check in a book without being authenticated. Let's do that now. And now we've moved on to the next error in line 84. Let's check that out. So of course we're failing to assert a count of 0, which makes sense because what we're actually asserting is that we have a count of 1. But if we grabbed it, then I expect this to be null. The checked in at time should be null. So let's just assert null. And then we only need one parameter for that. So this is going to assert that the checked in at is still null, meaning the book did not get checked back in. Run our test. We are green. Great. Let's move on to the second test. So only real books can be checked in. Do we really need to test this? Well, it's going to be a little tricky for us to even check this because it shouldn't have been checked out to begin with. We should still be getting a 404. So on better terms, I don't think we really need to check this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that test. Let's run the entire test. And now we're getting that. Let's run the full suite. And we are still green. We're making great progress on this. Let's check out that unit test, see if there's anything else. Let's check this out. So if not checked out, an exception is thrown. So if we try to check in a book that is not checked out, then we're throwing this exception. Now, in terms of the UI, what do you expect to happen? Well, I really kind of think that it should just be a 404. If you tried to check in a book that's not checked out, really it should just be a not found. I think that's good enough for our test. So let's do that now. All right, new test. A 404 is thrown if a book is not checked out first. Let's look at the happy path up here. So our happy path for checking in is right here. A book can be checked in. And actually on that note, we don't need exception handling. Let's go ahead and clean that up. All right, let me grab this whole entire test. We're going to have to modify it, of course, but we'll paste that in. Whoops, looks like I misspelled first. There we go. All right, so we're going to create a book. We're going to create a user, but then we're not going to check out the book, right? So we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. And then acting as that user, we're going to go ahead and check in that book, even though, again, we never checked that book out. So we really assert that we should not have a reservation, right? So reservation should be 0. But furthermore, we should probably assert that 404. So let's say assert is a status of 404. Let's see where that gets us. PHP unit -- filter. All right, so it says code 404 but received a 500. All right, you know what to do now. So without exception handling, let's go ahead and run that test again. And now we get an exception. So we are getting our exception in book line 33. So how would we handle that? Well, if we go into our check-in controller, I'm going to attempt to do this, but let's go ahead and wrap it in a try-catch block. So let's try to do that, and then let's catch basically just our normal exception as E. If we hit the catch block, let's go ahead and return a response And we're not going to pass in any data, but as a second argument, we do need that 404. So we'll run that, and let's run the test now. And now we get green. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and get rid of exception handling. And we can run this entire test just to make sure we didn't break anything. Yep, still green. All right, let's go back to the unit test. Let's see if there's anything else for us to do. So a user can check out a book twice. Well, this is a good one for us to test, but really, we've already tested this in the unit section. So we don't really need to worry about the endpoints. We know that the endpoints are just basically going to do the same thing of checking in and checking out a book. So because we have the unit test, we're not concerned with that. So that's it. With that, we do have the checkout and check-in sequence for our application. So this is what we're going to end up with. A book can be checked out by a signed-in user. So this is what I would call the perfect path. This is the path where everything went right. There is a book, we checked it out, everything worked out perfectly. Then we start to go into the edge cases where something didn't quite go right. In this case, what we're testing is that the user is not signed in. Picture something like the user accidentally logged out, then hit the back button and something happened. So we still want to make sure that we take them back to the correct page. Then this path is the really bad one. This is the one where this is not even a real book. This would be where the user basically goes in and hijacks the URL in their browser and tries to do something malicious by trying to check out a book that doesn't even exist. So we still want to make sure that we are properly responding to that user. Then we do the same thing for our check-in. So this is our happy path check-in sequence where we do have a book, we do have a user, we go ahead and acting as a user, we do check out the book, and then we try to check it in. Then of course, based on that, we know that everything worked out. Now the not so happy path, of course, would be if the user was to actually not be signed in for the check-in sequence. But of course, we do need to check out the book properly, and that's why this whole section here of the setup of this test is acting as a user. And then finally, we do have a 404 if a user tries to, for some reason, somehow check in a book, a real book, that they have not checked out. So this would be the sequence where obviously something went wrong when that book was supposed to be checked out, but it in fact was not checked out. And so when we try to check it in, of course, everything blows up because there is no reservation. So there's not much we could do for the user at that point. The best we could do is show them a 404 saying, well, we could not check that one in. That one is not going to work. So with that, let's go ahead and look at GitHub and see what we have made. So we do have a lot of files here, but they basically have to do with the fact that we ran that make auth command. So a lot of the stuff in here is stuff that we didn't really work on, but rather is the templates that get posted to your project whenever you run the make auth command. So all we really need to do here is say a commit of something like make auth and check out feature test. Let's commit that change, and let's go ahead and push all of our changes into GitHub. So there we are. Now do remember that all of the code for this series is available up in GitHub. If you go to github.com/coderstape/library, we do have the code here if you are following along. So last but not least, of course, don't forget to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and post them below, and I'll try to get to those in a timely manner. But that's it for today. Go ahead and implement this in your project, and when you're ready, let's move on to the next lesson.